Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ELEEP Virtual Discussion on citizen monitoring of fracking activities. I'm very grateful for your extra patience with us for our late start today. I don't want to lose too much time now with the introductions of the speakers. My name is Max Gruenig. I'm the president of Ecologic Institute in Washington, D.C. So I'm talking to you today from Washington, D.C. We have here with us three expert speakers in their own right. We have Sister Elizabeth Riebschlaeger talking to us from San Antonio, Texas. She is very active in the well, she will tell us more about it, but mostly in the Eagle Ford Shale region around San Antonio. So thank you for joining us from there today. Then we have with us here today Sam Rubright from the FracTracker Alliance. She's also joining us from Washington, D.C. And then we have a third speaker, Zachariah Hildenbrand, joining us today from Arizona. He's doing research in Texas on the environmental impacts of fracking. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us today. We will, of course, have a few presentations now and then also some time for discussion and question and answer. So I hope that we can start right away with the first input coming from Sister Elizabeth Riebschlaeger. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate. This is a very exciting opportunity with lots of potential, so I look forward to this very much. What we're looking at here are the counties of the Eagle Ford Shale, and they are gradually creeping in the northeastern direction, so they're not shown on this map. But as you can see, there's a huge amount of land mass involved. The DeWitt County, Gonzales County, Karnes County areas have many sweet spots where there's still active drilling taking place, by the way. And so waste is still being produced, people are still suffering from flares, etc. We can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to look at the drilling and fracking activities that really bring about the impact. Then production, midstream, and storage facilities, including flares, will be the focus, although that's not the only thing that has impacted the environment. Transport, roads, and pipelines. We'll focus mostly on pipelines. There's been a lot of publicity about road damage. And then waste disposal. I call this the orphan child of the industry because even the man who invented fracking or perfected it, got ready to up and go commercially, said to his children that we have things figured out now, but we still do not know what to do with all the waste. And there's more waste than anything else coming back from the well production sites in the beginning. So that's a major problem. And there's not enough regulation about where these should go and so forth. So that's a very important part of this presentation. The next slide, please. So we're going to look at the stories of the workers, the families, and the communities who have endured the impact. And this is mostly in the rural areas where the population is sparse, but the lives of people are very real. So we have workers who are impacted by chemicals, by frac sand. You see them not wearing any masks because the masks are today that are existing do not filter the fine sand that they use in fracking. Then we've had explosions in several settings, fires, they fall from the tops of derricks and so forth, so there's a lot of injury and worker endangerment in the frac sites. Then flaring and venting practices are also ongoing. The flaring has gotten a lot of publicity, but it's now better and more under control. Venting is not, because it's not visible to the human eye, and many people do not realize it's going on, but they wonder why they're feeling sick, why they can't breathe, why they're having headaches, nosebleeds, and so forth. We're going to look at the Lowry and their neighbors who were impacted not only by a plant behind them, but had to endure the effects of a blowout across the highway from them. Pipelines, we'll look at an explosion, the Big Bend Conservation Alliance out in West Texas, which is a different shale, but it's impacting the pipeline discussion, and then the Mexico protests in Mexico. The Gillette injection well explosion, the Altair solid waste disposal facility, which is in operation, and then a proposed facility in Nordheim, Texas, and DeWitt County, which has received quite a bit of publicity because a small organization in the community there is fighting the permitting of it and have managed to delay the location of that site 3 years. And then we'll talk about what happens to the generations to come. Next slide, please. So here are the workers, and we have here a slide where we can see 3 men loading what is called a perf gun, which I think is short for perforation. Many people don't realize that the initial frac is done with explosives underground. They were loading C4 explosives by hand into a perf gun, which then would be lowered into the hole by the crane that you see in the background and controlled by the people in the trailer that you see also in the background. Once at the right spot in the borehole, it would be detonated, and they would be then able to start the fracking of injection of high-pressure water, chemicals, and sand. A few days after I visited this site, I heard on the news that 3 workers had been injured by an explosion at a frac site, so I was hoping and praying it wasn't these men, but they were handling C4 explosives with bare hands. The chemicals are obvious, although we don't know what they are, because chemicals are not all listed on the frac focus site because of proprietary claims. We know that some of these chemicals have involved hydrogen fluoride acid, very dangerous, and in California they were being mixed at the site. Next slide, please. So flaring is not in compliance. We see 4 large stacks here that were, this photograph is from about 2010. This went on day and night. What happens is the unburned VOCs pass through the flame but are not destroyed by it, which is the purpose of the flare. And the black smoke we see contains other chemicals that are formed as the molecules rearrange themselves in the heat of the flare and reform into more toxic chemicals. That information comes to us from Dr. Neil Corman, who is a senior air quality scientist at Sierra Club Lone Star chapter in Austin, Texas. He worked for the TCQ for about 13 years and is very familiar with fracking and with the flares. Next slide, please. It's the same flare in the daytime. Notice this is a metal sign, and the paint is literally peeling off because of the chemicals. I'm sure the chemicals that are in the environment there. Next slide, please. Here is an infrared camera picture taken by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. The black smoke is actually venting of the condensates, or the VOCs coming off the condensate in the storage tanks. This is not visible to the human eye. There is a truck driver there somewhere. He can't be seen, but we see his truck. Most often they're outside the truck monitoring the input, or they're downloading the condensate into the tanks. So they also are exposed at that point in time, as is anyone who is downwind. Some of these sites are within 500 feet of homes, of animals grazing in a field. So they're all exposed to this. Next slide, please. So we go into a section called Communities and Families at Risk. I have a bee there because we know there's a great deal of concern about the bee population. I have to wonder also about the birds being exposed to this. That is a picture of a sled emission site in West Texas and a Native American dance there. May we go to the next slide, please? So here is the Lara family, Longino and Raquel Lara. Longino is going to need a liver transplant, not so much because of the flaring, but because of the fact that this city of Kennedy has a great deal of arsenic in the water. And so he also was on steroids for 2 years by a doctor once a month, and it probably contributed to his health problems now. They live across from the blowout. They live also in front of a big facility. We see small children here. One of the women is pregnant again. She already lost 1 child due to a miscarriage. The child lived for a short time after its birth, but then died shortly after, and doctors had no idea why, because there was no signs of a difficult pregnancy. But they were living in the house at the time of that delivery. Next slide, please. So we see here a picture of the plant, which is behind their home. I'd say about, Dr. Zach has been there, I think, about 1,000 yards. And we see the flare, and just through the red circle you can also see the house on the horizon. That's where they were living. And talked about the symptoms. We had to get them off the site, and they're now living in a town. This site is the Patton South Trust, operated by Incarnate. They are now engaged in a lawsuit. Next slide, please. This is a picture of that flare from their yard at night. Most of this awful venting takes place at night when it can't be seen, and the TCQ states that they don't have any investigators available at night to go out and check. I think that's a strategy, frankly. Next slide, please. Here we have a compressor station, very large compressor station, very problematic. These compressors leak a great deal, and there is posted on Earthlink by Sharon Wilson video of the emissions coming from the compressors at that same site, Patton Trust, which they are much worse than the flaring is, and they are not visible to the human eye, but that's on YouTube. Earthworks posted several sites, pictures of sites around Karnes County recently, and this is one of them. If you'll notice the yellow box on a post next to the gate, that is breathing apparatus. So this is a very toxic site. At this point in the geography of the Eagle Ford Shale, the content of hydrogen sulfide is at its highest level in the product that comes out of the soil, out of the ground. So it's very, very dangerous, and this is the only site I've ever seen that actually has breathing apparatus available to workers who, if they detect any odor, they've got to run, put on the mask immediately. That's how toxic it is. Next slide, please.
Sister Elizabeth, just very quickly from my side, just looking at the clock, if we can skip through some of the slides or go very well.
We'll go quickly. Thank you. All right, so Jack, be ready to move. Okay, this is a picture taken after the blowout. All the dead vegetation can be seen. Next slide. And this is a picture of explosion 40 miles away. A pipeline exploded near Lindenau, Texas. Very shoddy work was done on pipelines, I understand, by newly trained workers, and so we're going to see more of this. Next slide. So we have a pipeline rupture here. A new pipeline ruptured and had to be, all the soil had to be replaced. Next slide, please. This is venting going on in the early morning from pipelines, and they are allowed to do this. That's methane. Next slide, please. So we have pictures of all the shale areas that are in development or being considered for development in the future. Next slide, please. And this is a disposal well which had exploded and burned and had been replaced. That's for liquid waste disposal. Next slide. Here we have solid waste, and the blue arrow shows about 6 stories worth of waste stored there. This is a solid waste, 30% or more waste that comes out of the hole. Next slide, please. Then we have a satellite picture of the entire site, and the area blocked off in red is an actual school facility where they get all of these odors and chemicals, although this is all non-toxic according to the exception they received from the EPA. Next slide. So we have close-up of heavy equipment that is tossing this waste into the air, aerating it. Next slide. These are all the waste pit chemicals. You can find this same illustration prepared by Inside Climate News when they did their special. If you want to really thoroughly read about this, I would suggest you go to Inside Climate News and look at their reports on the Eagle Ford Shale. They have interviews, they have a lot of video footage, and it's very worthwhile, great place to get an education about this, including the chemicals. Next slide, please. So we have Skull Creek running off of that solid waste site, carrying some of these chemicals into the Colorado River. And the next slide is the 200-acre site outlined and is supposed to be the solid waste treatment facility outside Nordheim. It's almost the size of the little town itself. As you can see, it's right across the highway. Next slide, please. And so we have some citizens in Nordheim that have organized, and they were visited by a candidate for the Railroad Commission, who, by the way, did not win, but he visited the site, And so a lot of publicity has been given to them, and this has really helped, I think, in delaying this because they did get so much publicity. Next slide, please. So that's it. That is a quote from the Native Americans: "We are not preserving our earth and her resources for the children. We are borrowing it from them." So I like that quote very much. It calls us to our responsibility for the next generation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sister Elizabeth, and my apologies for being so tight with the time. Now you actually really caught up, and we're not late at all. So if members of the audience would like to ask questions, questions of understanding, they can do that right away. Otherwise, if there are no direct questions, I would say let's move on to our next presenter. So Sam, thank you again for being here today, and thank you also for presenting your work and your activities. Same rules apply. Time is short, so here we go. Off you go. Enjoy, and if we're fast enough, we have enough time for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for having me today. It's great to be here. So just to get kind of moving along, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll just tell you a little bit about FracTracker. We're a registered 501c3 with 9 staff members in different offices across the US. So we have in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, DC, and California. We work with oil and gas data to understand the industry's impacts and trends. We've also recently started exploring renewable growth data. Our website, FracTracker.org, was launched in 2010 and now provides maps for over 36 US states with drilling activity and some international drilling as well. Next slide. So to give you an idea of what it is we do, modern day oil and gas drilling, generally referred to as fracking, is occurring with greater frequency in the US. We've mapped over 1.7 million active oil and gas wells. 36 states are seeing some sort of drilling activity, and that's not including sand mining and other sort of peripheral activities related to fracking. Kern County in California, for example, has over 120,000 active wells, many of which are utilizing unconventional drilling technologies such as acidizing. Because of the massive scope of this issue, we often map and analyze national data sets where they're available. So in this example, in this recently released project on the screen, we helped Earthworks map community stories about living near drilling activities, such as those that were collected by Sister Elizabeth, FLIR imagery showing emissions from fracking sites, and populations living within a half mile of active oil and gas activity in the US. Next slide. And then also zooming in, some of our most valued maps are those showing state-level data. So this map of Pennsylvania, for example, shows the following types of data. Compressor stations in green. This is a partial data set that partners have actually helped us compile because it's not available at the state level. Pits are shown in blue and were crowdsourced using volunteers from a partner organization called SkyTruth. And then violations are the yellow dots, drilled wells in orange, and permits in purple, and that data comes from the state Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. If you can click again, it should zoom in on the map. There we go. So when you zoom in, you can actually see the points in more detail and click on them to learn more about a specific site or violation. One point might have several different layers, and in this example, a violation has been issued here. And this is also at the point where you can see permits and drilled layers. Next slide. But we also wanted to look more closely at some of the intersections between oil and gas data and people. There are so many different sites across the US that it's actually impossible to look at all of the different dynamics without having some people on the ground helping us. So because of this, we often collaborate with other groups on thematic or timely projects, and that may involve grassroots data collection and places where there are gaps in the knowledge base of what we know about fracking, such as waste management, as Sister Elizabeth mentioned. We felt actually that a mobile app might be able to help us do this and collect data from people on the ground. So after a lot of work and some beta testing, we launched the app in the fall of 2014, and we're also hoping to release a significant update to that app this summer. And our app is available for iPhones and Androids and can be downloaded from fractracker.org/app. Next slide. And now I'll just kind of walk you through some of the features so that you can get an idea of how to use it if you would like to download it. So generally you can see oil and gas wells near you on a map. You can submit reports about what is concerning you or what you're seeing around you. And this also includes the capacity to upload photos. Next slide. So first you've obviously got to download it, and then once you've launched the program on your phone for the first time, you'll be asked to allow the app to access your location. And this is really important because it helps the map and reporting features work effectively. And then you just tap allow to continue. And if you can click, Jack, it'll move us to the next slide. There we go. Since this is the first time you'll have used the app, we also ask that you sign in to fill in your name and email, but we don't spam or anything like that. This is just to help keep track of the reports. Then you click Save to continue. So next slide. So now that you're kind of logged in, the first thing you'll see is a map of the US. Every time you log in from here on out, this will be the map that you see. Now this is actually might be changing in the next couple of versions of the app, but right now this is what the layout is. The shades of blue on the map reflect well density by county, with darker blues indicating more wells. The red dots are user reports, but we'll kind of get to that shortly. And then you can zoom in on that map to explore wells and reports by region, just like you could on the website that I was showing earlier. If there are a lot of wells, you should actually have to zoom in pretty closely because it just will take forever for the phone to load. To zoom, you place your two fingers on the map and separate them, and to zoom out, you pinch your fingers. This process is similar to how Google Maps works on your smartphone. It'll be a little bit different, the layout and sort of the format on Android platforms, but it should be close enough that you'll get the idea. There are three main navigation items on the bottom toolbar all the time: the oil and gas map, which you can see here, the reporting button in the middle, and then the My Submissions tab on the right. The top toolbar will change depending on the page that you're viewing. For this page, we see that the toolbar on the top reflects a legend and a screen refresh option. Next slide. So here I've kind of zoomed us into a region that has a bunch of wells and a report. A pop-up box, if you click on one of those dots, will display sort of basic information about the point. This is a well in southwestern A, for example, called the Carnes-Donald unit, and it's operated by Range Resources. And you can see more details about the location by tapping on the blue eye. This will be any extra details that we have on the site, such as the API number or the date that the well was drilled. Okay, so let's see you're out on a hike and you've got our app downloaded and you see an oil and gas issue that you would like to share with others. Next, I'll show you how to submit a report on your own and add it to this map. So you tap the Submit button on the bottom toolbar to get started. Next slide. This is a screenshot of what the report form looks like, where you can share observations about oil and gas activity near you. The first box is for the date that you noticed an issue or took a particular photograph. The next line is a drop-down menu that allows you to select for the type of issue you observed, if there was one. The location type drop-down is there to let you add additional descriptors about the area. And comments is a really important place where you can include miscellaneous information, such as how the air smelled, or kind of if there was a lot of noise in the area, something that might not be captured by the photos. Credit refers to whether or not you would like to receive photo credit for what you've attached to the report. And additionally, if you want to group your photos with an associated project, like say you're out with a bunch of different people and you want all of your photos to be lumped together, you would include a label in that credit field as well. So none of the fields in the reporting form are required, but the more detail, the better. Tapping on the next drop-down box will allow you to add a location to your report other than the one where you're currently standing. And this feature helps if you didn't have very good cell phone service when you were out on your hike. The last green box is how you upload your photo, and it actually will pull up from your smartphone, or you can take a new photo directly from the app. And then from there you tap Save in the upper right-hand corner to submit, or Cancel to go back without submitting your report. All of the submissions then go into a queue for us to review. And this will also be changing in the near future. We wanted to include more submissions without having us to review them, so we're going to include a crowdsourcing feature in the future. Now, we won't get to this today, but if you follow the link on this page, and I think all of our presentations will be shared with participants after the webinar today, you can see how our app was used this past spring by volunteers and National Parks Conservation Association in Colorado to document Mesa Verde National Park's natural resources because there's some drilling proposed around the park by the Bureau of Land Management. Next slide. So that's in summary. Because the pace of oil and gas drilling is extremely fast, and we're a very small nonprofit, we rely on partnerships and people on the ground doing crowdsourcing and data collection to really keep track of such a fast-moving industry. You'll see in the rest of this webinar that obviously we're not the only group doing this kind of work, but we look forward to partnering with people. If you've got projects that you'd like to collect data and share it through maps, we'd be really happy to participate. So contact me, and I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I think the last points that you mentioned are very interesting because obviously you have regional focus areas depending on where you have staff and also where you basically have active projects and where you're most well in the field. And then of course there are regions where this is less the case, and that's not necessarily because there is not fracking activity. And so I think that's a very good point that we should bring to the discussion right afterwards. But I don't want to steal away time from Zach, who is the third presenter here today. So Zach, thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you also for being patient as the last speaker in the long row. So I don't want to take away more of your time so that we can also have enough buffer in the end for a discussion. Okay. And I give you the floor, so please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to be here talking about shale science. My name is Dr. Zachariah Hildenbrand. I've been working in this field of research since 2011, and I'm part of what's called CLEAR at UT Arlington, and that stands for the Collaborative Laboratories for Environmental Analysis and Remediation. And what our group does is we perform multidisciplinary research amongst biochemists, hydrologists, geochemists, analytical chemists, quantitative biologists, you name it, we have it on our team. And we are out there analyzing the basic question: is hydraulic fracturing, is unconventional drilling affecting the environment? So we've been monitoring air, soil, and water quality all across Texas, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania, and now we're also working with a number of citizen groups on some remote monitoring technology, as well as looking at remediation strategies and best practices when there are cases of contamination. So if we go on to the next slide. So what is unconventional oil and gas? So unconventional oil and gas is basically oil and gas exploration in unconventional layers of strata. Basically, this is not new technology, but they are using quite heavily what I would call evolved forms of stimulation, one of which is hydraulic fracturing, which is the use of chemicals, proppants, and water to extract previously sequestered hydrocarbons. We also heard reference to shale acidization, as opposed to expanding and cracking the shale to pull out the hydrocarbons. With shale acidization, you're essentially dissolving that zone with either hydrochloric or hydrofluoric acid. And so obviously this comes with a number of different environmental concerns, particularly about environmental stewardship. So if we look at groundwater quality, in our analyses, we found organic molecules, chlorinated species, various alcohols, and metal ions that can be associated with unconventional drilling. We have found these in studies all across the state of Texas, into Pennsylvania. We recently just published a paper where we monitored groundwater quality before, during, and after unconventional drilling, and found that the water was relatively pristine before, and that there were notable changes after the induction of drilling in that region. There's also concerns about air quality. We've heard from Sister Elizabeth stories about compressor units, condensate tanks, and these flaring stations that can emit a tremendous amount of BTEX molecules. This is benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, in addition to primary hydrocarbons such as methane, propane, and ethane. It's also important to touch on soil integrity. We find that a lot of these sites where there is these BTEX emissions or polyaromatic hydrocarbons being emitted into the air, that those compounds, if they are not broken down either via flaring or if they are not broken down by UV degradation, then they percolate down into soil where they can accumulate, primarily in softer, loamier soils. So that's obviously a concern, because when you start talking about soil accumulation, you have the potential for what's called ex situ accumulation. So if you have, in particular, the region in the Eagle Ford there, chemicals accumulating in the soil, that's an area where there's tremendous poultry and beef production, also grass production, that can then get into the food chain, and then it can ultimately get onto our dinner table. We've heard a very similar story in California, where they're recycling of these produced or wastewaters for agricultural activities. If that wastewater is in fact afflicted with these chemicals, and there's still residual compounds in there, then theoretically those could accumulate into the produce and then get into the food chain. So that brings us to the final concern here is regarding human health. And so we've worked with a number of different families that have been affected by unconventional oil and gas, and we're looking at new methods to look at this at a larger scale. We're looking at developing a method for screening BTEX molecules and polyaromatic hydrocarbons in urine, for example. That would be a very easy analysis to look at accumulation of these compounds in areas where there is shale exploration versus areas where there's not shale exploration, to kind of quantify the relative effect there. But that's something that we're just embarking on now. If we move to the next slide, please. Okay, so some of these concerns just visually. Here on the left we have a water well. This is in the Barnett Shale of North Texas, in a region where you've got private water wells that feed small family homes that have been afflicted with high levels of dissolved gas. In this particular image, you have a water well with an actual gas vent that it is needed to vent off and separate some of those hydrocarbons from the water, and you're able to light that on fire. In this particular community, the water itself actually does light on fire, and we're just finishing up an analysis trying to characterize, first off, is this a result of drilling, or is it a result of a naturally occurring process, and secondarily, what is the exact mechanism through which this methane and dissolved gases got into the water. On the right here, we have an image of a waste pit. So there are varying stages of unconventional drilling. You have the drilling phase, you have the stimulation phase, which is where they would utilize hydraulic fracturing or shale acidization. Then you have the production phase, where they're producing the hydrocarbons, the oil, natural gas, condensate. Here we have a pit, which normally these pits are lined and are not as shabbily constructed as this one. But here we're out in the middle of West Texas, where you don't have anyone to really enforce the integrity of these pits, and you don't really have anyone to enforce how waste solutions are managed. And so basically you have a pit which was dug out by a backhoe. You're dumping fluid into this pit. And what we found in this particular instance in collecting a sample of this pit is that there were compounds in there that we had also found in shallow groundwater and also in surface water in that region. So, understandably so, when you have pits like this and you have rain, then there can be spillage to other surface bodies of water, or they can percolate down into shallow groundwater. So this is obviously not optimal. The alternative to this type of management is through the use of underground injection wells, in which you're taking this waste, pumping it deep underground into an unusable body of water, brackish water or some kind of layer with great porosity where it can absorb all this material, Unfortunately, the drawback of that is that has been attributed to increased seismicity, in Canada, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas. So that's obviously a concern. Next slide, please. So getting into some of the work that Sister Elizabeth discussed here, the primary issue in the Eagle Ford, because it is such an industrious process down there, they're pulling out tremendous amount of condensate and oil. It's a very industrial, there's a lot of components to it. And one of the research projects that we embarked on is actually looking at air quality in and around these pad sites. We've had a tremendous opportunity to work with some landowners and gain access to their pad sites, where we have a mobile mass spec unit that can actually quantify and characterize BTEX concentrations and essentially do point source attribution of emission sources. So it's pretty cool. It's a hybrid vehicle, which you have a mass spectrometer in the passenger seat. Then you've got someone in the back seat who, on their computer, who is able to look at the data in real time, not only concentrations, but it gives a geospatial time and GPS stamp. If we go to the next slide here. So here's an indication. So this is basically a heat map rendering of total BTEX emissions on some of these pad sites. And what you can see right away is that you can see some of these pads, while they have the very same anatomy across all of these pads, they all have flaring stations, they have condensate tanks, they have compressor units, heater treaters, H2S scavengers. They all have the same basic anatomy, but some of these are cleaner than others. So this is bad news and good news. It's bad news in the sense that you see here the pad on the left. We have these hot zones, which are where large amounts of BTEX are being emitted into the air. We're looking at concentrations of about 7 to 8 parts per million in some cases, just continually being emitted into the air, which again is accumulating into the shallow soil and the shallow groundwater or shallow surface water. But you see that on this particular image, you see 3 major red dots, and what those represent is you've got at the very top here, you've got a series of condensate tanks which are emitting BTEX compounds. The bottom right, you have a flaring unit that's contributing to BTEX compounds, and at the bottom left, you have a H2S scavenger. This is pulling out the H2S, which can affect the composition of the oil or the condensate, and that's also emitting BTEX. And so what we find here is that if we look at this second and what we see here is that there is a heater treater on this pad which actually is using a different solvent base than is being used on the pad on the left. And so we can make a very simple recommendation that, hey, this heater treater that you have over, or this H2S scavenger is using the wrong solvent. You need to use the same solvent as is being used on this other pad. And right away, we're able to clean up this process. We see this in the image on the right here. Again, another pad with all the same anatomy, and what it was here was that another hydrogen or an H2S scavenger, which is using a organic solvent base as opposed to an alcohol-based mechanism. We were able to work with the operator, inform them of these emissions, and then they made the correction right away. So that's obviously in everyone's best interest. We go to the next slide. And as I alluded to, I mean, here we have a string of pad sites. This is on one of the case studies we're doing down in the Eagle Ford Shale, and we look at it color-coded. You have the white dots represent 0 BTEX detections in the soil. Yellow denotes a 1 BTEX detection. Orange is 2. Red is 3, and a blue dot illustrates where all 4 BTEX species are detected in the soil. And what we found is, and this is kind of counterintuitive to us, is that the BTEX is not necessarily relative to distance to pad site. As you might imagine, you would think that as you get closer to these pad sites, there's going to be a higher concentration of these compounds in the soil. Well, it turns out it's totally driven by soil type. And a lot of the soil around these pad sites is very, very firm caliche limestone and very, very sandy soil. And so what happens, and even if you have a tremendous amount of emissions, that are percolating down onto the surface, that soil type just keeps those chemicals on the surface where they then get broken down by UV degradation. So they're basically just baked off by the sun, which gets very, very hot and very sunny in South Texas. Whereas if you look into some of these other areas of the ranch where the soil is softer, it's loamy, it's more I guess facilitating of accumulation of these molecules into the soil where they stay around a lot longer. So again, what we've been able to learn here from both this air and soil analysis is, one, we can identify inefficiencies in the process, which can be remediated right away. That's great news. And secondarily, we do need to remediate these things right away because it's obviously having an impact on the peripheral areas. You know, this particular ranch here, they raise black Angus beef, which goes out to the market. They grow hay, which goes out to other ranchers for their cattle and livestock. And so obviously if there is an accumulation of BTEX molecules in the soil, that will get into the grass, that will get into the animals, and then that's obviously concerning for all of us who eat beef, not to mention just the general well-being of those animals. So if we go to the next slide. So one of the projects that we're looking to embark on with a series of citizen scientists, if you will, or concerned citizens, it's with a group out of Canada. They are called EOSense, and what they've been working on is developing a remote methane sensor. So basically this is something you can put on your water well, you can have water trickling through it on a continual basis, and if we go to the next slide, basically this can be shooting data to the cloud on a continual basis, where people who also have the app can monitor methane concentrations. So not only can we identify areas where there's high levels of methane and they need to be addressed, but secondarily we can monitor change. And we can do so without having to go out and collect samples. I mean, a sample of dissolved gases can run upwards of $400 to $500 per sample. And here we have a unit that costs, just under $1,000. We can put on your well, and you can be collecting measurements every 10 seconds. So you may have a methane concentration of next to nothing, but then obviously if you start to see a spike, then you've clearly identified that something in your water chemistry has changed, and that's worth characterizing further. So it's somewhat of a sentinel technique to identify issues of contamination. But as Sam alluded to, there's a lot of value in a lot of these citizen scientists collaborating together, collecting this information, because it's very, very expensive to get on your own, to go out there with equipment and a team. And whereas when you have people who are just integrating this as part of their daily lives, it seems like a much more efficient way to go about it. So this is something that we're working on, in addition to working with a group out in the Dallas area, and actually a scientist, Dr. Larry David, who is looking to build drones which can fly over pad sites and characterize air quality emissions. Looking at things like methane emissions and BTEX, by simply flying a drone over top. So that's a project that he's started working with NASA. We're lucky enough to be a part of that. As much as I would like to clone myself and have thousands of myself going around collecting this data so we could get this great database of information, it's much more efficient just to teach concerned citizens how to use this technology, so we can all be collecting the information simultaneously, we can all learn from each other, and then we sit down and interpret the data responsibly. So it seems like a much more efficient way to assess the environmental impacts.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you. I'm sorry to cut here a little bit. I think that was a good closing word, because that's very much coming back to the header, to the title of our little session here. I'm just looking at the clock, and we're running awfully close to 1 p.m. at least here on the eastern seaboard. Of course, less so in Arizona, where you have a slight advantage time-wise. But nevertheless, I think that's very interesting. If I look at the three speakers here, I can, well, we have the people represented by Sister Elizabeth. We have the mapping and the app represented by Sam, and then we have the measurement and the actual scientific monitoring here with Zach. This is, of course, overly simplified, and I hope you don't take offense in this very brief characterization. I want to come first with a question from the audience. So we have here online with us Regina Buono, and asking Zach specifically whether he could share afterwards maybe the paper or the citation for the paper that you mentioned regarding the pristine waters that were affected by fracking. So if you could share this in the aftermath, that would be great. Yes. And much appreciated.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That paper was recently published about 2 months ago in the journal Science of the Total Environment. And to elucidate a little bit further on that, basically we monitored groundwater quality over the course of 13 months and found no chemicals in the water before the onset of drilling. And as we found more of these wells coming into place, there seemed to be more of these chemicals popping up in the water. We also saw a dramatic increase in pH and total organic carbon. But what we also determined is that there are a lot of natural processes going on, i.e. microbial metabolism, that are using these chemicals as a carbon source, and so they're constantly being broken down. So we believe that these contamination events are while they are occurring, they're rather ephemeral in nature, transient, kind of here, they're there, and then they disappear. So yes, I'd be happy to share information, and if anyone is listening, my email address is zac@inform, INFORM, env.com. Be happy to share any of our peer-reviewed publications with anyone or answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, that was a prompt answer. And I hope, Regina, that this was more than satisfying. I would like to also ask you a question, Zach, and that's, okay. You mentioned this EOSense, the citizen science. Of course, really, that's a breakthrough, and that's very impressive. But then, if you look at it, you also wonder, how do they ensure that actually the measurements are accurate? How is this verified? How do you make sure that this the quality of the results is somehow of a quality where you can still use this for legal or regulatory purposes?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So when trying to develop a technology like this, I always envision that I want to develop it for someone like my mother. My mother is a lovely lady, but has no idea how to use the computer, the internet, no idea how to use technology. We need to have something that you can pull it out of the box, you can put it onto your water well, plug the hose in, and that's it. And that's what we're doing right now. We're doing a lot of beta testing of this technology out in the field. Obviously, the technology itself is built upon sound science, peer-reviewed literature. So anytime you have a technology or a scientific method that has been published in the peer-reviewed literature, it does hold up. It is admissible in court. So if someone is using this Sentinel technology and finds it fine over time, and then all of a sudden there's a huge spike, and then we later find out that this was indicative of gas well contamination, they would have proper legal standing to use that data in a court of law.
And I'd like to also add to that. I mean, citizen science has been involved in regulatory decision making for a long time. Pennsylvania used to have a citizen science water monitoring crew that it was part of how the state was fed data from volunteers that went to collect water quality information. And so it's sort of, if you can think of it also as a tier, you've got different levels of data being collected, and they all have importance, and they can all be used in different ways, just as long as you're following the same kind of protocols that Zach was mentioning about keeping it simple, but also making sure that you follow the same structure every time. But I think it's going to be one of those areas that we see a lot more of participation from citizen scientists, especially in the energy field.
Yeah, great. And it's very interesting because it can be done obviously in different fields. It can be done for air, for water, and for soil sampling. It requires, of course, some funding. That's I'm sure that's always an issue, even if it's a lot cheaper than taking that many samples with qualified scientists. There's still the equipment issue, but it's great to see how many people are active in different areas. And obviously the map or the app that you're running, Sam, is kind of something that can be maybe connected, because we saw also at the very end in Zach's presentation, we saw the map with the measurements then coming into the cloud. So I would envision is kind of the next evolution, combining these different layers that you also mentioned. So combining the professional and the citizen science layers and getting all this data in a way or layered into one map and accessing the data. How do you see this as an option, and when do you think we can get there, Sam?
I mean, we can get there right now. Any data that's geolocated, such as the point location information that Zach was collecting, any of that can be uploaded into a map and shared with other data being collected in other regions. There are already regulatory agencies and industry looking at this information to make better decisions. So now it's just a matter of collecting that data, getting it into a format. You know, his presentation when he was showing the map makes it visualizes data in a much easier way than trying to show it on a spreadsheet. My parents are the same way. There's no way that they would really grasp a spreadsheet of data and points, but if you show them on a map and you take photos and you have FLIR imagery and videos and personal stories, that kind of information is going to be a lot more conducive for having a conversation about some of these impacts.
Thank you. Sister Elizabeth, can you hear me? Okay, great. I wanted to know, since you do a lot of field exploring and talking to people, what do you think, or have you used the app already, or if you haven't, can you imagine using it and applying this when you tour the country?
Oh, absolutely. I give tours of the Eagle Ford Shale. It's so hot these days, we've kind of eliminated the tours until we get cooler weather. But anybody, a number of people on those tours would be perfectly capable of doing this. I think the advantage is for the rural community is that often they're out of touch with researchers in the urban areas. And there are a lot of people there who know how to utilize this technology. It's not that complicated, who from their own ranches and farms or neighborhoods or communities are beginning to understand the reason why they need to be concerned about their environment. So now I think they would be ready to come on board from where they are to utilize this app to get some support from the scientific community to help them understand what is happening, to help them deal with what is happening. So it actually broadens out the exchange not only between the flow of information from the grassroots to the resources, but from the resources back to the community. That might be also possible. So I think this is going to be an invaluable leap forward in the collection of data and in setting up a system of really education of the populations that are usually out of touch in rural communities. So I think this is really important.
So that's great to hear. So I would really suggest that Sam and Sister Elizabeth, that you maybe get in touch to go through the initial setup of the technology and then maybe see how easy it can be applied or what questions come up when it's used in the Eagle Ford Shale. It's really exciting. We have another question regarding the app from one of our viewers. It's Doug Carlton asking, is the FracTracker app set to initiate an action for an agency if multiple reports come from one or the same specific site? And would agencies be willing to use the data for emergency response?
So we're not quite set up yet for initiating actions. The update that I mentioned during the presentation that we're going to be pushing out in the next month or two, hopefully, is going to have a feed with it that let people see kind of as people are submitting reports on the app, they can see it more live, and so that will allow folks to better connect with the other users within the app. Now, I've already had conversations with certain agency folks that are already interested in how to utilize this kind of data, because it's not data we're going to keep and store and try to publish on, and then 5 years later it's available to the public. This is going to be real-time data that is accessible to any of the users, and we can also work with agencies where whoever is actually interested in this kind of data to handle emergency response, to handle whatever kind of issues have been brought to the attention through the users.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you. Zach, now question to you. You've seen the app maybe for the first time today. I don't know if you had heard about it before.
I have, yes.
You have. That's great.
I'm a big fan.
So you know it. So what potential do you see for it, for combining it with your work? Because I see the app is kind of, I mean, the focus of the app is, of course, on first localizing incidents and then taking a snapshot, a picture, and maybe also some verbal description or qualitative description, whereas your work is about then actually taking the measurement. So I'm really excited about the potential for linking these two, and I wanted to ask you where you can see or how you can see linking these.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, ideally, what we'd like to do, and we've seen it with some groups that we met at Earth Day, Texas this last April, is you have some groups where they are teaching citizen scientists how to go out and collect measurements for surface and groundwater quality. So, for instance, they have kits that we can give these folks where they can do basic water quality measurements, pH, total dissolved solids, oxidation reduction potential, dissolved oxygen. We could even do salinity and conductivity. These are things that they can collect those measurements in place, and then they can report those findings, give it the GPS stamp, and then we know kind of how water quality is in that region. And I think if you give the opportunity for more people to be involved, obviously in something like a FracTracker, where they know they're contributing, and obviously these people, they're there to provide an honest effort and provide the best data that they possibly can. And so to be part of a large network of folks that are talking together, collaborating to provide a better understanding of environmental quality, one, that is going to guide either industry colleagues or government agencies to identify areas of concern where they can much more efficiently go in there and do an investigation themselves. I think it's going to save them a lot of time and money in doing that. But secondarily, I mean, there's so many concerns about hydraulic fracturing and unconventional drilling. And the truth of the matter is we don't have enough information all across the shale plays to really know the extent of the situation. If I were to follow everyone on my Facebook feed, for example, you would think that there are these horrible atrocities happening all across every shale play, every single day, all the time. All these wells are failing simultaneously. And the truth of the matter is that it is an industrious process. Yes, there are inefficiencies, and yes, there are problems. Blowouts occur, pipeline failures occur, well casing failures occur, surface spills occur. But we need to work together to do a more targeted analysis of these things so that we can act upon them much more rapidly. And I think that's what the FracTracker does. It allows you to have more information to make more intelligent decisions in a much more expeditious fashion, and that's great news. That's great. That's in everyone's best interest.
Thank you, Zach. I think that's a very good point, that we're basically bringing the available technology levels of big data, because we have so many drill holes. It's actually very different from looking, if you look at coal power plants, if you're concerned about coal power plants, it's a very finite number compared to the number of drill holes. It's also continuously evolving, so you obviously need to up your technology, and I think that we're getting there. It's obviously not the end of the line yet, so we see the relaunch of the app coming in 2 months' time, and obviously probably a few months later we hopefully will get new generation and next generation after next generation. And obviously your work, Zach, is also, it's not ending anytime soon. It's impressive to see also how much drilling activity there's happening, even though currently it's not a very attractive environment price-wise for the oil and gas industry. But that just gives us an idea of how much there could be also if we have a research of the oil and gas prices on the global markets. So I think we have pretty much exhausted our timeline. I want to give each of you the opportunity to say something. It does not have to be a summary of the session. That would be maybe asking too much, but maybe something you want to add, like a final closure. Please don't exceed the 30-second line for this. But if you want to go ahead, whoever wants to go, you can go first. Because that's kind of a surprise element. But Sister Elizabeth, are you ready to say something? Do you have to unmute yourself?
How's that? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. This is a coming together of different perspectives, which can really create collaboration for increasing our understanding of the impact of fracking on our environment and our world. It will accelerate the process, I think, because of the direct concept and the direct communication of data without having to go through intermediaries or interpretations. The interpretation will come, but the data, the raw data, is very important, and so I see this as accelerating the process. I'm not a scientist, but that's my viewpoint of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Elizabeth. So, Sam, do you want to go next?
Sure thing. So just happy to be part of this conversation today. It's been really nice meeting everybody who has been on board. I really want to come down to Texas and check out that mobile sensing unit, Zach. That looked pretty fancy. And I'm also excited. I want to come down and visit Sister Elizabeth and maybe do a tour, because it's not an area that I'm as familiar with. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, so I'm definitely more associated with the Marcellus Shale.
I'd love to, and I think I'm about to get another car, so you may be breaking in a new car.
You cannot come to Texas and not visit Sister Elizabeth. It's absolutely essential.
Thank you, Zach. Same here.
So, Zach, now, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for this opportunity. Obviously, as we grow science in the shale field and become more collaborative, that's in everyone's best interest. I mean, I have a picture here of one of our coasters. This is part of our creative package created for our research group, and it says, support unbiased science. And that's what citizen science is all about. I mean, let's come together, let's work with academic groups, let's work with technology companies to collect this information, interpret it responsibly, and so that we can make more informed decision about this practice. I think all too often when we hear fracking and we hear unconventional oil and gas drilling, we immediately come to two polar extremes. One that it's completely safe, and one that it's harming at 100%. There's contamination happening at a rate of 100%. And the truth of the matter is, it's in between, and we need to make intelligent decisions about this so that we can ensure that these contamination events are not happening, and that the process becomes more efficient.
Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you, all of you. Thank you to the three speakers, but also I would like to thank, of course, our audience, our participants. I want to thank the team at Ecologic Institute in Berlin, especially Andreas Graf and Jack Tarpey for supporting this event and making it possible. I want to thank, of course, the entire ELEEP network for providing the opportunity and infrastructure for hosting such a meeting. And then, yes, we mentioned it in the beginning, this was probably like the slow time of the year to host a public event that's not directly political, at least. So we definitely should repeat this or follow up on it, rather, at a later point in time. I hope you all found it very exciting. I learned a lot. And I hope we can continue this, and I hope we can also continue linking our different regions, linking different states, different groups across the United States, and also going beyond, going into Europe and other parts of the world. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to close the session for today. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your days wherever you might be. Thank you. Bye-bye.